We're starting with
All
Lobster.
right, guys. Episode 4, Return of the King with Morgan Aldous here. All right. So, how does it feel to be not an admin anymore of this group?
The relief is immense.
That's good.
No, it's with my laissez-faire approach to adminning back when I was admin, I wasn't doing a lot, but I didn't realize that there kind of was like this responsibility on my shoulders that I didn't realize it was there until it was gone. And I don't know if this has happened to you yet, Alejandro, but I would oftentimes like get messages from people. They're like, "Oh, this thing's happening. You need to do something about it." And I'm like, "Dude, read the label."
Yeah, I get those every now and then. I usually get messages from people who are like, I think this person's trying to sabotage the group. And no one has done anything like that yet. So I'm like, oh, I'll look into it.
Like, how would you sabotage a group?
Yeah. Well, and those messages were almost always from people that I didn't even recognize. They're like non-participants. They're like NPCs. They're like, don't even participate. And then they send my DMs to let me know my group is in danger of infiltration and stuff. I'm just like, what is going on? Leave me alone.
Speaking of infiltration, we did get, there are a few DesNat accounts, some pretty big ones too, I just learned. Like John Bennett is in here and he got doxxed. Whatever, but he doesn't do anything, so I'm like, whatever. As long as he doesn't like bully people, we're fine. And then we got this guy named Bill, which I kicked out, and he's like, I'm on a mission from God to expose all the DesNats in your group, starting with, and then he listed a bunch of like,
wild.
He was wild.
He sounds great.
He's obsessed.
Yeah, he would send me like audios all day, like talking about how like obsessed he is with DesNat. And then he started bullying certain people in our group, like Hannah Syriac. And I was like, no, we can't have that. And then Quaku left because I think he felt. Yeah, Quaku left because he felt like this guy Bill was gonna go after him. So I'm like, okay, we can't. We can't have this. This guy's not a team player, so let's get him out of here. And he wasn't like. Yeah, so he was just. Yeah, he was nuts. He's a weird guy. Like, how could you go after Hannah? Hannah's like so nice.
She's great, yeah.
But
yeah,
everyone on this podcast wants to know, Morgan, why did you kick out Jacob Hanson?
Everybody knows why I kicked out Jacob Hanson.
Well, yeah, we won't go into it. That's yesterday's news.
I can't remember. It's drama. We're past that, yeah.
Did he start his own lobster group?
I heard that, yeah. My question for you, Alejandro, though, is why have you kept him out?
Oh, that's a great question.
Has he applied back? I don't know.
No, he hasn't applied back. So that's one reason. He just hasn't he hasn't sent in a request. That's number one. But number two, if he were to what?
He can't, because when I booted him, I made it so he can't even see that the group exists.
Oh, really? Oh, I did see that. Yeah, that's true. Well, he hasn't reached out to me either because I blocked him for a while, and then I didn't know all the ins and outs of like what the admins can do and stuff, and so I blocked him. And I figured, well, if I block him, then I can't see if he ever wants to get back in or what. So I unblocked him. But yes, you're right. He can't see our group. But even if he were to ask to rejoin, I would be hesitant just because I think it was Jackson Washburn. He made a great post on Thoughtful Saints where he's like, Jacob has this pattern on not just the Lobster group, but like in liberal groups and conservative groups and all these groups, and the result is the same. He just doesn't seem to know how to interact with people in such a way that fosters like a conducive, like enabling discussion, and that's not what we're about. So, I mean, Jacob, if you're listening,
I just got some questions to ask.
Yeah, it's like no, I mean, someone brought this up to me a few weeks ago. They're like, I can't remember who they were talking about, but they're like, would you rather hang out with Jacob Hanson on Christmas or like someone crazy? I can't remember who it was. And I was like, in person or
Look
like
up Hanson,
online?
it's fun.
And I'm like, I'd probably hang out with him in person, but not online. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure he's a fun, nice person in real life, just not on the internet. And so, well, there's only so much you can do about that.
I think that's a good answer, because that really has been my experience, that like you get totally different sides of people online versus in person. Like there are people that I thought I hated online, and then I met them in person and really liked them, and vice versa. People that I really liked online, and then I met them and I was like, I don't want to hang out with you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I on Twitter, it's weird because several people from Desnat were actually at my wedding, and they were like really nice individuals. And I was like, yeah, you guys are totally welcome here, but don't follow me on Twitter.
That's funny.
So,
But
speaking of making the real world touch the internet world, we have Lobster Conference in 1 week. 1 week from today, Lobster Conference is going down. We have the works, man. We got a caterer. We got a person doing some catering for us. We're recording it. We got some like semi-professional tech set up to record this thing. We got Roots Counseling sponsoring it. He's been able to acquire the hotel. So yeah, we're doing this at a hotel. Usually we do this like in someone's living room. So I'm super excited.
pretty fancy. I know. I wish I lived down there.
Me too, Anthony. I wish you lived here, dude. Yeah. But Morgan, you're going to be one of the speakers at Lobster Conference. How are you feeling about that?
I'm excited. It's one of my favorite things is to get up and present and talk about things that I love and that interest me and that I've found beneficial. So I'm looking forward to it.
Very cool. So this year, what do you have in mind? Give us a preview of what you're going to be speaking about.
So I've been thinking a lot about Zion, and the whole project of the restoration originally was Zion, and we don't really talk about that anymore, or when we do, we talk about it in these like really weird ahistorical terms. And we've really just kind of like lost sight of it. And sometimes I'll mention this in like social media discussions and stuff, and inevitably someone always pops up. They're like, Zion is in our awards, or Zion is in our stakes. What do you mean we don't have Zion? And I'm just like,
where is it? I'm trying to look.
Yeah, I'd like to know what ward and stake this is. And like one time there was something came up about Zion in a Facebook group, and I mentioned, I said, yeah, we just have to look to the Book of Moses. That's the handbook to Zion. That's what the early saints were working towards. And somebody was like, well, like, what do you mean? I was like, well, it's a society of one heart, one mind, dwelling in righteousness, with no poor among them. That is the Lord's indication that those are the requirements that must be met for the Lord to call a people Zion. And then somebody commented, they're like, oh yeah, that would be really nice, but I don't think we're going to get there till the Lord comes again. And I was just like, my brain like short circuited. I was like, no, the Lord's not going to come again until we achieve that. Like that's the whole project. The whole point of the restoration is to build a Zion for the Lord to come to. And she was like, what? I've never been taught that. And I'm just like, ooh, maybe you haven't.
Yeah.
So
that bugs me so much.
Yeah. And what really helped me to realize this was I was taking 2 institute classes at the same time concurrently. One of them was on Saints Volume 1, which had just come out, and the other one was on the Book of Moses. And because I was studying the Book of Moses at the same time that I was studying early church history, like very, very specifically and chronologically, that really opened my eyes to like, whoa, like a lot of the language of the early saints and a lot of their ideals and everything comes right out of the Book of Moses. And everyone loves the Book of Abraham because it's so weird. and it like goes into like sacred astronomy and stuff, and that just like gets us excited because we love symbolism and weird stuff. But we really sleep on the Book of Moses. The Book of Moses is a very important sacred text, and it doesn't even have the controversy of of the Book of Abraham either, because
yeah, you would imagine it have even more controversy.
Yeah, but at the same time, it can't, because like with the controversy with the Book of Abraham, it's like, okay, we have these texts that Joseph said he was translating from, and modern Egyptology gives us this different picture. So what exactly was going on here? Whereas the Book of Moses is easy. Joseph's just like, receive this by revelation, here it is. And you can't really argue with that like you can the Book of Abraham. But it's a really, really powerful book of scripture. It's one of my favorites, and it's one of the most ignored. And it really was the text that the early saints were using to guide their vision of Zion. And so I would like to see the Latter-day Saints become more acquainted with the Book of Moses and have a little more respect for it and try to follow, because the Book of Moses just gives us this archetypal roadmap toward the Zion society, and it gives us these countering images of what a Zion society looks like and what a corrupt society looks like. And that starts with the division between Cain and Abel, and then just goes through narrative after narrative after narrative, some of which are in our modern Genesis and others are not. But it's just full of these narratives saying, this is what this society looks like, this is what this society looks like. And if you want to ascend like Enoch's people, you better build a society like this one. And we just don't talk about that in church anymore.
It's true. You don't really hear about it that much in church, right? And I was kind of curious, definitely the Book of Moses, like I said, as an archetypal roadmap. Do you feel similarly about like 35 leading up to 4th Nephi? Because people think of, as I've always sort of 4th Nephi as kind of like a text about Zion, right? Kind of like maybe the outcome at the end, in a sense. So how do you see like the Book of Mormon connecting to that, or is it, does it, really in the same way that the book?
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I think that 3rd and 4th Nephi definitely tell the same story as the Book of Moses. I think that 3rd and 4th Nephi take the lens more of a history. It's a very specific people at a very specific time dealing with very specific things.
A lot going on.
Yeah. The Book of Moses, though, has a massive chronology. It's huge. It takes up this huge span of time. There's all these different characters popping in and out. It's not just one society. It's like the story of a bunch of different societies that come and go. And it taps into these much older stories. So this is a Jordan Peterson podcast, right? So that's one of the things that I've really gotten from Dr. Peterson's work, is really appreciating the Genesis stories as just these very old, distilled, told and retold, cast and recast stories. And because they have that nature to them, they're not just a history written by one guy, which is what the Book of Mormon is. It's this oral tradition that's been given and given and given and given, told and retold, worked and reworked, and then somehow this new version comes through Joseph Smith. And I don't pretend to understand the mechanics of that, but it's just these much older stories that are much more archetypal and mythological than historical. And I think we can apply that to our lives better than we can the story of the Nephites. But that's also something we should apply to ourselves too. We're told right in the text of the Book of Mormon to apply their story to us too. So they both work, and I think they both have value. But the Book of Moses, I think, just has a broader, more sweeping vision.
For sure. And if I can just add one more thing, why do you think we've, in general, like seems like so many people have lost the plot? Like you were saying, there's that understanding of, oh, well, when Jesus comes, that's when I'm going to be ready to build Zion. Like you said, like, it's just like, you've got it totally backwards. I guess you could like to say, well, it's difficult, but like, why do you think we struggle so much to focus on like building designer, we think that it's already here. And I just think we're so on the surface as a people, like we aren't vulnerable in the way that I feel like we would be if we were truly design society. We aren't like, as just the partisanship, like so many things. But anyways, what's kind of your view on that?
Yeah, so this won't be a surprise to anybody that is likely to be listening to this podcast, but I take a lot of my ideas from the alchemical tradition and Hermetic philosophy and everything. And in Hermetic philosophy, there is what's called the Law of Correspondence. And the Law of Correspondence is as above, so below, as within, so without. And, Christian Hermeticists will point to the Lord's Prayer that Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount as an example when he said, on earth as it is in heaven. That's another way of saying this principle. So if the world without reflects the world within, then I think that when we are diagnosing social problems, we would be wise to use that as a diagnostic for internal psychological problems. And so when we talk about the failure of Zion, we're saying that we have failed to build a society that is of one heart, one mind, dwells in righteousness with no poor among them. And if we are failing to build that at a social level, then if the Law of Correspondence is correct, which I believe it is, that simply means that we have failed to build that kind of environment within our own psyches. And that might sound a little strange because we're used to thinking of ourselves as individuals. And, the Western liberal tradition, which I have long been an advocate for in general, puts us in this position of seeing ourselves as individuals. But that's a political thing. We have to look at ourselves as individuals when it comes to political units, but psychologically, on the inside, we are not individuals. and that's what Jung said was like the whole task of life. That is the task of being human, is to become an individual. You don't come into this world as an individual, you have to become one. And it's really terrifying to realize that we are kind of each of us really is kind of a loose jumble of subpersonalities with this conscious ego trying to keep the lid on everything. And so I love what you said, Anthony, about how one of the indicators for Zion is that we would have, more vulnerability with each other. And I think that the prerequisite to that would be to have more vulnerability in our own internal discourse. We have so many defense mechanisms that keep all of these individual subpersonalities in line and quieted so that our conscious ego doesn't have to lose its illusion that it's the only one in there. And it takes humility and vulnerability on the part of the conscious ego to begin to recognize, understand, and reclaim these different subpersonalities.
Our ego is working so hard for us, isn't it?
Yeah. And,
well, it's interesting you bring that up.
As you were talking about, I just thought about, kind of tying it back to Peterson. I was just going to say, set your house in perfect order before you feel these issues in society, but maybe it's really just within ourselves first. I just kind of thought about that, setting our own internal house in order before we start going after other people and saying, you're the problem in the world, not I have issues.
Yeah, 100%. We were talking about this actually. I was at a family home evening or come follow me meeting in Seattle about 2 weeks ago, and we were talking precisely about this issue about building Zion, and I mean exactly what you said, Morgan. Like, what's external is also internal, and in Luke, the famous scripture, "The kingdom of God is within you." I brought that up at the meeting, and it shifted everyone's focus because they were kind of thinking about it like you said, as a physical, literal type of a place. And that's not exactly, I mean, that's partly true, but like the whole truth is like it's also internal. And I think what people feel is they feel alienated, they feel like they don't have control over their passions, they're slave to addictions. And then I was reading Terrell Given's book, All Things Become New, and one of the things that he was talking about this in relationship to sin and being perfect. He didn't really touch on the individuation idea that Jung kind of talks about, but what he did talk about is this idea of being whole, which is similar to kind of being an individual, an entire person. But he was saying, he gave an extreme example, like the most extreme depraved people, serial killers, mass murderers, whatever. When people started to examine these people and kind of look into them, they would all realize or discover that these people had traumas and pasts where they were hurt and they were kind of lashing out. And so he kind of argued that, you know, we engage in sin because we haven't healed from something yet. And that's part of like that individuation process, that shadow work process where you look, you know, you're incomplete when you're wounded, you know, and you have that, I don't remember how Terrell puts it, but he called it something like the spiritual woundedness, where these things are unconscious, that we've repressed them, we've ignored them, or we feel that we can't address them, and so we shove them under the rug. And the Jung was a Gnostic, and not only that, but he was a Romantic, and so he very much felt that the world was sort of like within the psyche, and then you kind of express that outward.
And I'd like to point out too that the prophet Joseph Smith was also a Gnostic and a Romantic.
Oh yeah, 100%, 100%. I think that's why his message resonates so much with us, because we're like we're living in the echoes of romanticism, which is why things like eternal marriage and like this super expanse vision of the afterlife just appeals to us. But along with that is all that is within you, and you can express that out, and that maps on exactly to like this idea of Zion. That Zion starts with you, and then you build that, and then once that's built, then the Lord comes.
Yes, and you know the analogy that I like to use is when we're trying to build Zion without doing the inner work first, when we try to do the outer work, it's like trying to build a temple with fractured foundation stones, and you just can't get very far that way. And so if we're going to build a temple to receive the Lord at his second coming, we need to get the stones whole, and that's us as individuals. And it's as I've talked to some people about this, they've kind of criticized me a little bit, saying, well, no, like you need to do the outer work too. And it's true. It does need to be simultaneous to a certain degree. But I emphasize the inner work so much because it's the piece that's missing, I think. It's the piece that we're just not really aware of, which is ironic because it's, you know, of course it's the part we're not aware of. It's the subconscious aspect of the work.
Yeah, it's interesting that we see Christ, right, as like the foundation, and that we're all members of the body. We're all kind of part of what makes the church. And I feel like you're kind of saying, we're each kind of like one of those stones that are laid in there. And so I think if we think of ourselves more as being that, you know, building fit together, I don't know exactly how the Bible, you know, speaks of it. It definitely makes it seem different to me, the way I kind of think about it. If I'm thinking like I'm part of the foundation of Zion. It's not just an external to me, like a place or a building. Like I am part of what makes Zion. You know, if I'm not where I need to be, then that building is not going to be able to hold, kind of thing. You know, if I'm part of that.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, we talk a lot in the church about the eternal family, but we don't talk about the internal family. And yes, exactly. Internal family systems is for those that are listening that aren't aware, internal family systems is a therapeutic modality. It was developed starting in the 1980s, and it was developed by his last name Schwartz. I can't remember his first name right now. Richard Schwartz. You can fact check that for me, Alejandro. But he trained as a marriage and family therapist. But when he would work with individual clients, he noticed something in their language that was very telling. And what he noticed was that individuals talked about themselves the same way couples talked between themselves. And he came to realize that there is this like internal world, and and all of us have experienced this. This is evident whenever you say, part of me wants this, but part of me wants this. And so Dr. Schwartz developed this whole theory and this therapeutic modality. It's sometimes called parts work, specifically because of that. And so in this therapeutic modality, you find these parts that are wreaking havoc. And he developed this system for figuring out what different parts are doing and what they want. And so when there's traumatic experiences or other things, this part of you that holds that becomes what he calls an exile. And in order to protect it, it gets put away. And in front of this exile gets put a protector, or sometimes it's called a manager. And these protectors, exactly what the label says. The protector is there to keep the exile protected and to keep the system in working order, because it fears that if that exile's pain got out, that it would interrupt the whole system. And then there are also what are called firefighters. My therapist doesn't really deal too much with firefighters. I've talked to a lot of therapists that do internal family systems, and they don't really use the firefighter part of the model, but a firefighter is really just a super reactive protector. And in the middle of all this is what Schwartz called the core self. And that's, where your creativity is and where your love is and your compassion. And so the whole point of internal family systems is discovering these different parts and bringing them together. And that's Zion. When we say to be of one heart, you can think, okay, one heart, that makes sense. One mind, okay, yeah, like the Savior talked about, having your eye single, and that makes sense too. Dwelling in righteousness, okay, I think I can understand what that might mean. But then the part with no poor among them, that sounds weird. It's like, how are there to be no poor among my different internal parts? There isn't really an economy. And so what I take that to understand is that all of these different parts are getting what they need. They're getting their needs met. They're not exiles anymore. And so I'll give some personal examples for this. I was recently with a group of friends, and there was someone in the group that I had never met before. And I just had like this weird defensiveness towards this person. I'd never met him before. I had no reason to feel this way, but there was just something about him that just like irked something in me. And I thought, okay, this is really interesting. Carl Jung said, where your wound is, there your task is. And I take that very seriously. So I try to pay attention to when I have these kind of internal reactions, because I know there's some work to be done there. And so I went in my next therapy session. I told my therapist about this, and we kind of brainstormed some ideas of what it might be. And he said, okay, I wonder if you can kind of reconjure that feeling, that defensive feeling in your body again. And I thought, okay. And I kind of sat there and thought, and I said, okay, yeah, I can kind of feel it. And he said, okay, tell me where it is. And I located it kind of under my rib cage on my right side. That's kind of where that anxiety was centered. And in addition to internal family systems, my therapist also uses this modality called brain spotting, which I've talked about a little bit in the Lobster group. Brain spotting uses eye positions to locate neural networks. And so the short version is that our brains project a three-dimensional map of themselves into our field of vision. And so when we move our eyes around to look in different places, we're activating different parts, different neural networks, because we're coordinating with the internal and external map. And there's the law of correspondence again. So with brain spotting, you will take something that's distressing and you will locate it in your body. And then the therapist will move a pointer around your field of vision, and you pay attention to what happens in your body. And when you find the spot where that feeling in your body is the most activated, is the most intense, then you just stay there and you just keep your eyes fixed there, and you just see what happens as that part of the brain is activated. And so my therapist pulled out his pointer. He said, okay, hold on to that feeling under your right rib cage, that feeling of defensiveness you're having towards this person. And he moved the pointer around, and we found, this has been a couple months, but as I remember, the spot was kind of to my upper right, and I just looked at it. And as I looked at it, that feeling of defensiveness became more intense. And then it was like I dropped into my body, and I saw there in that spot, and this is so hard to describe. Like if you haven't experienced it, you can't really describe it. Words really fail, so I'm doing the best I can. But it's like I was in a dark room, and it was almost like there was a bright doorway, and there was this person standing there with his back to me. And I understood that person to be this part of me that was being defensive. And in the internal family systems model, he was a protector. And I got very emotional when I saw him. He had his back to me, and I asked him to turn around, and he wouldn't. And he just like didn't react to any of what I was saying to him. And at the end of the session, I kind of came back out, and my therapist and I kind of talked about the experience. He's like, yeah, I think you have a protector there. And so that week, I tend to give myself therapy homework. My therapist harasses me about it sometimes. Like, I'm the one that's supposed to assign homework, but you do better assignments than I do, so I'll let you keep doing it. And so the homework that I gave myself for that week was to really contact that protector. And I've done a lot of shadow work, and I lead workshops on this kind of thing, so I knew what to do. My favorite tool is to use incomplete sentences. And what you do is you just write the sentence, you kind of get in a relaxed state, you get the conscious ego out of the way, and then you just quickly write 6 to 10 endings to that sentence as fast as you can without thinking. And that gives the subconscious a chance to release some material and get past the conscious ego's filter. And so I was doing these writing exercises, and I was doing sentences like, if the defensive part of me could speak, he might say. And I was getting endings like, I'm trying to protect you, I'm trying to help you, you should be grateful, just like all this stuff. And I was just, it kind of upset me. I was like, can't you see this isn't working? Like, you're making me an asshole, and I don't want to be one. There's no reason why I can't be friends with this person, but I just feel this defensiveness towards him, and I can't. And it's because of you, Mr. Protector. So why don't you step aside? And so it was a really interesting week kind of wrestling with this. And then towards the end of the week, I remembered that our own Milton, who also does internal family systems therapy, had sent me some resources months ago. including some meditations to do as part of internal family systems. And so I suddenly remembered that for some reason. I mean, not for some reason, obviously there was a lot of mental forces going on that I had put into action through what I was doing. But I went and I looked at these meditations, and one of them was called a protector meditation. And I thought, oh, this might be helpful. So I laid down on my bed, I popped in my earbuds, and I played this meditation. And it guided me through this relaxation and then locating this protector. And again, I found it in the same spot in my body, under the right side of my rib cage. And then this is the part I was missing. And I'm really glad I used this meditation because it gave me this missing part. It said, one of the things that it guided me to do was express gratitude to this protector, because it was simply trying to keep me from feeling too much pain. It was protecting me from rejection. And I realized that that's what this defensiveness was. In psychology, we call it defensive detachment. It's this protective detachment. It's like, okay, I'm going to reject you before you can reject me. And I realized that's kind of what was going on. And it was a very emotional experience that I had because I'd been connecting with this protector all week, from that therapy session on Monday night, doing the brain spotting, all the way to this was Saturday. And I'd been doing those sentence stems in between and everything. But I realized that, I was contacting this protector. I'd become very aware of it, but I was angry at it because I felt that it was wreaking havoc in my life and doing me no good. And all of that changed with that meditation that made me realize, oh, he's not doing it to ruin my life. This part of me is doing this to protect me from pain and from the pain of rejection. And everything changed. My relationship to this protector changed. So then the next day was Sunday. I was getting ready for church, and I had this very strange experience, which I've been having these kind of experiences for the last couple of years as I've been doing my deep psychological work. So I'm used to it, but I know it's going to sound weird to other people. But as I was getting ready for church, I suddenly witnessed this argument between my parts. This one part said, you're really making it hard to make friends. And then this protector said, I'm trying to keep the friends you have and stop threats from messing that up. So you better be grateful. And this came with like this burst of affect and emotion. And I got very emotional and was like, holy cow, and then I did what I had learned in that meditation. I just expressed gratitude. And I don't know what that other part was that started this fight, but for the protector, I said, I honor you, I thank you. And I carried that into my sacrament meditation at church. And it was just a very emotional day, getting to know and be grateful for this protector. And I thanked him, and then said that I didn't need him anymore, and that he could step aside and let this rejected exile go, which happened the next morning. I was at the gym, and I was just lifting weights like I usually do early in the morning. And out of nowhere, I was just getting these intense feelings of rejection. And I didn't know what they were from. It was like nobody was actually rejecting me, but I had the distinct feeling. And it really fueled. It was one of the best workouts I've ever had, because I just put all this sadness and rejection right into my muscles. That's the best thing to do with your feelings, hide them in your muscles. My lifting buddy was really freaked out. He came over at one point. He's like, "Are you okay?" I was like, "Yeah."
Good advice. Turn your emotional pain into physical pain at the gym.
That's right, exactly. And I kind of explained to my lifting buddy what was going on, and he kind of understood. And we now joke. I'm like, at the beginning of every workout from now on, I want you to bully me and tell me that I'm worthless and that nobody loves me, because that was the best workout. He's too good of a guy. He won't do it. But anyway, so I, as luck would have it, this was now Monday and it was time for therapy again. So I was talking to my therapist and I explained all this and he was like, wow, like, hey, good work. That's it. You found this protector, you contacted hgot you heard from him, you expressed gratitude for him, and you got a little taste of what he was protecting you from. And I'm not under any illusion that the work is done. I don't think it is. And I continue to work on this both on my own and with my therapist. But that's an example of what I'm talking about. And so becoming a Zion individual means, because this outer relationship with this other person was being blocked because of this internal blockage, this part of me that was keeping another part of me hushed up because it was too painful. And so in finding this part and understanding him and hearing him and thanking him, giving this gratitude, and then making this attempt to release him, and then experiencing the pain that he was protecting me from, that's the work of Zion. And as it turned out, the next time I was with this group of friends and saw this person, I felt a lot better towards him. I didn't have as much of this defensiveness towards him. And so that's how we build the outer Zion, is by doing this inner work. And we call it shadow work because it's unconscious. It's the conscious ego has just stuffed all of this where it's not seen. Jesus said, if the eye is single, then the body is full of light. Well, until we do that work, the body is full of shadow. And we've got to bring that light in and discover what's there, and bring all of these parts of our personality together so we can become of one mind, one heart, dwell in righteousness with no poor among us.
So to me, it's interesting. It's interesting how you talk about how you interact with these people as if they're real people, because they're you. But here's what I'm getting at is, well, a person who's not very familiar with psychological terms or psychology or therapy, or could even be skeptical about it, I can almost hear them saying, like, this sounds really radical. This sounds like something I'm not used to talking about. But then one of the things that I really like about what you're saying here is that just the very act of using your imagination and engaging with your imagination to tap into these parts can foster an environment where you can gain a lot of insight. They even did a study where if you took a control group, right, and they said solve this problem, and they took another group, they said, okay, pretend you're talking to someone about the problem and then try and solve it. And the group that pretended to talk to someone, and to pretend to have a conversation about the problem, they had a much better time solving that problem than the people who just tried to do it. And it's not like they received help from anyone else. It was just that dialogue of trying to tackle the problem with someone else that gave them the insight to put the pieces together to solve the problem. So I think for me, that's an example of like a psychotechnology where we use the where you engage in what's that term? It's not imagination, but it's the imaginal, or the what does Jung call it? Do you know what he calls it?
Like
imagination. Active imagination. Yeah, exactly. Active imagination. Perfect.
Yeah. And that's, Jung did this to an extreme degree. He spent several years just doing nothing but active imagination. And he kind of dropped into this madness is what it looked like from the outside. But I mean, this is what he wrote in his black books, which he then condensed into his red book, is his experiences with all these strange characters he met. And it was all internal. And what kind of his main guide through all of this was this angel named Philemon, that, and in internal family systems, perspective, you know, that may have been his core self that kind of led him through all of this, and he saw these very strange visions and everything, which I think you could easily say, you know, like, oh yeah, like he met his exiles and his protectors and everything else. These are all just different vocabularies and metaphors to get at the same thing that's hard to talk about. That's what
I totally agree, because when I talk to normal everyday members of the church, they talk about repentance and forgiveness and faith, but they only talk about them in those terms, and they don't really, they talk about them as if they're things that they assert, you know, like, oh, I'm repenting now and it's done, and I have faith now because I said I have faith now, and but it doesn't really, like Anthony said earlier, it seems all very surface level. Vulnerability isn't opened up, and then they feel conflicted. Well, if I'm repenting, why do I still feel like this crazy sexual desire, this crazy anger, or why do I feel like I want to chew my mom out or whatever, and I must not be a good person because I have these feelings? And it's like, no, all these feelings are like, they serve a function, and you're like, you don't know what that function is. It's literally unconscious to you. You're trying to figure out what that is, and figure out how to bridge those gaps, and you can be that whole person and understand what function those feelings of rejection serve, or those feelings of lust serve. And it's, I think the problem that we have as a society is we feel that certain emotions are just bad, they're just off limits. I'm not allowed to feel angry or lustful or whatever, or ashamed. I'm not allowed to feel ashamed.
which is a shame generating thought.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's not the right approach to that problem. It's like, no, you feel conflicted. You have competing motivations, competing feelings, because you're trying to get at something and you're not sure what that is. And yeah, it's like part of being whole, part of being an individual. You're aiming at goals. You're aiming at healing certain parts of yourself that are wounded, like deeply wounded. And if you need to use like your imagination to like have a conversation with that part of yourself, that's an excellent way to approach it, because you're going to have insights that you don't otherwise have. There's a book that my wife and I are reading called Let God Love You, and in that book, in one of the first chapters, it's written by a therapist. She talks about how she felt that at certain times she couldn't connect with God for whatever reason, and when she was in her therapist, she didn't have like an appointment that day or something. When she was in her own office, she pretended or like imagined that God was there in front of her, and then they had a conversation. And like just imagining that can be a very emotional experience, because it's God we're talking about. But once you do that, you open up that part about yourself, and you can understand like why I'm scared to have a relationship, not just with God, but like with those parts of myself that are keeping me away from God, and that were sort of like exiling. That's probably why it's called that, because you literally repress them, you shove them under the rug. So I don't think Latter-day Saints should be alarmed that we talk about these representations as if they're real, because they're literally a part of you. We're just representing them with imagery, and like, yeah, that's like a part of yourself that feels exiled, or that feels like it's a firefighter or a manager that's reacting to these problems.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something, Anthony?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, so kind of like talking about those representations, like, well, this is what I'm used to. I mean, even if we go to the scriptures, like the one Morgan shared, I thought it was really interesting. The one about, oh my gosh, I'm blanking. Oh, right, about the eye being single, right, and then the whole body should be full of light. And what you were talking about, Alejandro, with the book by Givens, about, you know, repentance is like, you know, that healing, that internal healing that has to take place. I was reading the NRSV today in Matthew, and it was one of those verses that I read. I think it was maybe in chapter 6 or 7, I can't remember. The way it translates it is basically, if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. So whether single means healthy or not, like I hadn't ever read it that way before. So this translation, that it's the fact that it said healthy in place of single, it just was really interesting to me, because I think, yeah, like if we're psychologically healthy, then I think it's because we're right kind of dealing with that shadow and letting that light in, like Morgan's saying. But if not, then yeah, whatever's going on inside is, the light's not in there, you know. And yeah, I mean, like we've all had experience. Like I'm going through that right now, you know, kind of like going through my own kind of faith crisis. And it's amazing to me that as I've allowed myself to kind of deal with things that I always put under the rug and didn't want to acknowledge that I actually felt a certain way, like suddenly I feel like I'm feeling the spirit more. And it's like contradictory to like what I thought it would be like in terms of like where I'm feeling it and like why I'm feeling it. And so I'm having to process all this new information, but I know that in the end, like I trust in God that it'll, you know, be where I need to be. It's just, I'm kind of in this chaotic place right now, but it's a good place to be, as much as it's also causing me a lot of pain. And I still feel desires to repress and be like, oh, I don't want to talk about this, you know, I don't want to talk about it with other people. But I know that eventually it's going to be the point I need to talk about it, you know, to talk to people, especially those closest to me.
Yeah. And that's, you know, Anthony, that's another alchemical dictum, is solve et coagula, which is Latin for separate and combine. And that's what this work is. In internal family systems, they call it unblending, which is kind of splitting things out and seeing.
Being broken. Yeah, I feel like I'm being broken into pieces right now. You know what I mean? I'm trying
Yeah.
to figure, like pick up what I, you know, pick up the pieces and try and reform it somehow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what the work is. You know, you unblend, you solve, you dissolve, and you kind of, okay, here's all the parts that this thing is made up of that I maybe thought was a whole before. And then you kind of take them out, dust them out, get them all in proper order, everything. And then when you recombine them, that's the work of individuation. And so kudos to you, Anthony. I know that you've had you've been doing some difficult work, but it is important to kind of take these things apart and look at what's there. And then, you know, kind of get those emotions out that have been repressed. And that's part of the purification. And then you can bring everything back together.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks for, you know, you're a great example of that. So appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
I was talking to Anthony about this a few days ago after our podcast with Milton, and Anthony, you were reading a part of the scriptures. You know, you're reading about Nephi. You know, and Nephi, you know, he sounds like an a-hole. He's like this stuck-up kid. Yeah. You know, he's like, yeah, I'm so much better than my brothers. You know,
being large in stature. You know.
Yeah, right. Dude, that's such a
his virtues. It seems like sometimes.
That's such a bro comment too. It's like I'm awesome and I'm freaking stacked, you know. And no, but
and I kind of was saying, like, you know, maybe because I'm a Lamanite, that's why it bugged me, because I come from that Lehi line supposedly. So
yeah, no, but I think it's interesting. Like when you have a faith crisis, I think I know so many people who left the church for so many different reasons, but it all starts with a faith crisis. And what I appreciate about what you're doing, Anthony, is that you're like re-examining this. You're saying like, oh, well, what's really going on here with this guy?
You read it differently depending on where you're at, you know, like more critically, more differently, you know. And it's not always necessarily a bad thing. I think we get scared, like, oh, it's off the deep end. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I did jump off the deep end, and I'm swimming in the water right now. So eventually, I guess I'll get a life, you know, like a little lifeboat. But right now, it's my job to swim, and you got to kind of let me do that, you know. Sort of thing.
Well, I was talking to a friend of mine, and she said that her therapist told her that when she was 14, I think I mentioned this in the previous podcast, but I'll mention it again. Her therapist told her something like, well, you know, when you were 14, you had the gospel, and it kind of was a framework for you that helped you make sense of your life. But now that framework is no longer working for you. So you need to just get rid of the framework. And so she left the church, and I was kind of bummed about that. But I think, well, anytime you reread a work that's sacred, be it, you know, the Bible or the Book of Mormon or the Pearl of Great Price, some people would even argue that the reason why those books are sacred is because every time we reread them, they continue to be relevant across spans and spans of time. Every time we reread these works, and so they have like adapt to them, and it's like. You know, you're awestruck by just how profound these works are because they continue to be relevant throughout. And you can
find that even in other, you know, even non-particularly Christian scripture. Like I downloaded the Guru Granth Sahib, which is like, you know, the kind of collection of teaching of the gurus for the Sikhs, and it's interesting to like read that in tandem with like the Bible and the Book of Mormon. because what
Oh,
they are
yeah.
sharing is so interesting. It contextualizes it in a whole different way. Something with about
Oh,
how
100%.
it takes a whole different kind of view, but it has so much similarity too. And so it's all these different frameworks. So what that therapist, when she's like, you need to get rid of your framework, I'm like, I think it's you need to rework the framework.
Yeah, exactly.
Ditch it altogether.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, no, 100% agree. Like, I think, for me personally, it was.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so yeah. So for me, it was like when I was having these big doubts, when I started reading other books, and philosophy and different religious works and poetry and literature, it's like it expanded the framework, and it kind of filled in the gaps. Like there were assumptions that I had that were not the most sound assumptions, and what it did is it got rid of those and it replaced them with like stronger, more validating ideas that made sense of my lived experience. And so I understand, no, I don't really understand, but I can empathize a lot with people who say there's this aspect of the gospel that doesn't make sense to me, that seems like it's erroneous and it's also causing me harm. And when I hear whatever they're talking about, I'm like, yes, it's because one, it is erroneous and it is causing you harm, and yeah, we should get rid of it, but we should put something in its place that's sounder and that's more wholesome, is the best way I can put it. And that only comes by. Sorry, go ahead.
Just gonna say, this is another insight I think we can get from Peterson is, we will get this anomalous information, or what to us is an anomaly. It's always been there, but we didn't know about it. So we experience it as an anomaly in a phenomenological way. And one little anomaly can just obliterate a well-constructed map. And I think the mature thing to do, and it's hard and it takes work and a lot of conscious effort, is to update maps instead of throw them away. It would be like throwing away your laptop every time it requires an update instead of just, going through the annoyance of running the update.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's like there are certain things you value in life, right? And you value them usually it's because your tradition values them, right? And for us, it's like the LDS perspective, the LDS tradition that informs what our value system is. Well, if you throw away that map, you're not exactly sure what to value anymore. And then the question becomes, well, what do you value? And I'm sure you can come up with answers that seem reasonable to you, like, oh, well, I want to value the here and now. It's like, yes, we can do that. That's actually a good thing to do. But then it's like, are you now like disregard like that eternal perspective as well, or are you gonna now, like, the best thing would be to balance the two. It's like balance the here and now and balance your eternal perspective, so you can like heal now and you can be well off in forever from now, 10 years from now, wherever the case may be, however you want to define eternal. But reconstructing that map and expanding that map, it's really hard. That's why faith crises are so hard. Like, it feels like you're lost. It feels like the lone and dreary wilderness, like in Lehi's dream. And yeah, exactly.
That. I mean, perfect representation, right? In a lot of ways.
Yeah, I love that representation personally. And it's like, and then people have a reaction to that. It's like, okay, well, if I'm going to be lost, like, would I rather be lost in this wilderness, or would I rather inhabit like the superstructure, dogmatic institution that is going to tell me exactly what to think and what to do at all times? Because that's easy. You don't have to think when you're in there.
Floating in the air.
Right, exactly.
Foundation, though, does it?
Exactly.
It's almost like that's what the great and spacious building could be, is maybe this kind of, oh yeah, I know everything. We don't always think of it that way when we read it traditionally, but like, kind of, yeah, like, oh, well, you don't just totally believe, like, point the finger, at people who can't figure this out. Isn't it obvious? Like, obviously this is true.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, that's...
No, let me just mention one last thing. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Give me 1 second. One of the things that people who leave the church do is they say, well, they'll talk about the great and spacious building, and they'll say, yeah, that's actually the church itself, or that's the Salt Lake Temple, or that's how they'll use the imagery. It's like the church Inc. is the great and spacious building. And it's like, I get why you're saying that, and you're not totally wrong, but it just depends on what your relationship to that is. So, anyways, Lehi's Dream, go read it with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
But Morgan, go ahead and sorry I cut you off earlier.
That's fine. Because what I was going to say is right in line with what you were saying. One thing another aspect of Peterson's work that's really helped me is, there's this temptation, because of our modern understanding, is that when we encounter these archetypal images, like we find in Lehi's Dream, we immediately want to start, assigning. It's like, okay, this is this, this is this, this is this. And, but mythologically, that's not how it works. That's one thing that Peterson goes to great lengths to talk about in Maps of Meaning and some of his other work, is that every image, every archetype has its valences. And so that's the ironic thing, is the same church that, has been trusted with holding the ordinances and therefore is like the nursery of the tree of life in its positive valence, can be the same institution that's also the great and spacious building in its negative valence. And that's part of why I think mythological thinking is so important and why we need to bring it back, because it's religious thinking. And that's one of and that's one of the harms that has been done and passed on to us from the Enlightenment, is we as moderns are trying to do religion with Enlightenment tools, and they're not the same game. They're not. We're trying to do religion with the tools of science. But you do science with the tools of science, and you do religion with the tools of religion. And one of the things that's been lost is the tools of religion. And I think that's an important distinction.
For sure.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That's, just the conversation we were just having about using imagination to like represent parts of ourselves as people who are real. I mean, that's not a stretch. Like, it's really not a stretch. You're real. Your feelings are real. Like, that part of you is real. And to treat them as if they weren't real is a huge mistake.
Yes.
And so when you, and also the problem, I think people who kind of are skeptical again of psychologists or psychology as a field, or like even a Jungian approach, because science itself isn't monolithic. Like, people disagree within science.
Yeah. That's the thing I love when people are like, trust science. I'm like, science is a method, not a.
Read the philosophy of science and then get back to me. Read Kuhn and Popper.
Oh my gosh. Most scientists don't even do philosophy, and that makes me so mad. Because anyways, we're going off into the science into the science realm. That's a different podcast. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, no, like, we're using these tools, we're using imagination, we're using imagery, symbolism. That's the language of religion, and like you said, Morgan, like we're not educated in those things. When was the last time you took, your kid isn't taking symbolism class in public school, and your parents probably aren't super aware of symbolism. Most of them aren't anyway, because we live in a super literal, objective framework. And then, like I said earlier, in the previous podcast with Christina Rossetti, and John Vervaeke would agree with this, and Anthony, you brought this up too. It's when we try to fit religion inside of like a literal box, we turn it into an idol. And I mean, just imagine for a second how ridiculous like idolatry is. It's like, are you going to worship a wooden pole? It's like, because you believe that wooden pole is literally the deity, and it's no, like, of course it's not. Like, it's not. That's ridiculous, like having it's a representation for something else. That's a bit more plausible, but still, like, literalizing everything turns those things into an idol, and I think we missed the boat completely when we do that. So what I would do, I love movies. I really love movies, but like, one of the things I do when I read, especially novels, is this is just for fun. I imagine you have the main characters, right? And then I assign a cast, like, oh, the main character for me is going to be George Clooney for this book, and it's going to be Brad Pitt for that book, and I have these famous actors be the characters in the book, and it's more fun for me that way because I can sort of imagine it kind of like a movie. But you take the scriptures and you say these aren't just words on a page. Like, try to imagine like the picture that they're trying to present, and because that's how people thought. They thought in images before they thought in words. Most of the people before, it was like 99% of the people before 1850 could not read. They didn't have that available to them. So they thought in images, they thought in art, they thought in like representation. So we're losing that as we sort of abstract everything into words or into math equations.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, I'll make another plug for brain spotting too. Is one of the great things about brain spotting is because traditional talk therapy, which I do advocate and I benefit from, but it requires language and it relies on language. But a lot of our attitudes and traumas and everything happen to us when we are pre-literate and even pre-verbal. And so some of these psychotechnologies that I would actually argue have some ancient precedent, they're nonverbal, they're experiential, and they can get to these issues and help rectify these issues that you can't reach through verbal or literate means. You have to reach them through image means and through emotional means. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I just think of the temple with that, and how we try and kind of learn through that way. And even then we want to be like super literal with it sometimes. But I was just thinking when you're talking about brain spotting, I immediately thought of EMDR,
Yes.
which is also using, kind of that visual right sense of getting into trauma. And, at first when I first learned about it, like kind of skeptical, but then like my wife has personally benefited from it a lot. And even she was a little like, is this going to work? But like, it's amazing that there are these kind of, like you said, like kind of I don't know if precognitive is the right word, but like kind of, yeah, like not really necessarily using language or just talk therapy alone, like with this kind of movement of the eyes and all these things can tell us so much. It seems like, oh, that would be a bunch of hooey, but like, no, like it's working for people. So how do you explain that? Like,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's the thing that I think a lot about with therapy is like, it's not so much the specific modality as much as like, is it working for people? Like, is it helping them? Are they able to connect with it on some level? Then that mode that just like helps them, and maybe it's just different for different people. So I've read, for some people who have certain mental illnesses, like Freudian, psychotherapy has like been like what they needed, and then in other contexts, it's like it doesn't work at all for these people. And some different psychologists will argue like, oh well, this is evidence based. This is evidence based, and it's like y'all are just missing the point, So my favorite therapists are the ones that kind of realize like there's a lot of different ways to approach it, but that kind of sense of what's working best for the client is really like paramount. And I remember talking to Milton and he kind of agreed with that. And there's another formerly LDS psychologist that I follow, and that's the same thing. Like he talks about psychology as he talks about the magic of psychotherapy. Now that would be like anathema and like like psychological science or something like that. But I agree that it's an art and it's a study more than just a science per se in the way we think about it. Even Sigmund Koch, a philosopher of psychology, talks about how he thinks that psychology belonged more in the realm of social studies than it did social science, which upsets some people, because we're like, well, we've got statistics. I'm like, therapists are so bad at statistics anyways a lot of the time. Like we've had to be corrected by the American Academy of like statisticians to be like, this is actually what you can and can't do with p-values. You guys are doing it wrong. And so I'm like, you know what? Just forget math.
And Anthony, you make excellent points about, these different approaches work for different people and everything. And I know that they've studied this, and what they found is, beyond, these different modalities and philosophies of psychotherapy and everything else, the number one factor in success in psychotherapy is the relationship that is between the therapist and the client. And that tells us a lot, that healing occurs in relationship. And in the gospel, that's so important. That is why it is so important to develop a relationship with Jesus. because that's where the healing happens. And to go back to what what you've been saying, Alejandro, there's an imaginal aspect to this. I think that one of the reasons why we have a hard time developing a relationship with Jesus is because we have a hard time imagining Jesus. And as long as he is the Christ, which is an idea, which is an archetype, he's safe. But as soon as we can imagine Jesus, the man, that we can have a relationship with, that's where the healing happens. And there's nothing more horrifying than that. So we don't do it.
Oh yeah, well, somebody was talking the other day, or I don't know who it was, but they were kind of bringing up like with McConkie, you know, how he was kind of very much against like personal relationship with Jesus Christ. He's like, well, you know, you have to kind of go through this like more hierarchical. And I get kind of what he's saying, I guess, from the church standpoint. But yeah, I think like, you know, people are afraid that you can go all these different ways when you have a personal relationship with God. But I'm just like, I don't know, it's kind of what's working for me right now. You know, whether it perfectly aligns with, you know, everything or a certain set view of teachings or whatever. And I would argue in the church that if we believe in continuing revelation, that has been like, you know, adapt and change and you know, kind of be revised even. I think we just stick so much to these kind of dogmatic views of like, we need to have like a creed. I'm like, wasn't that the whole point, is to get away from the creeds? You know, I don't know, I just random thoughts flying through my head. Don't even.
Well, no, I mean,
yeah.
you brought up this point. We were talking about this before we started recording. You brought up the point about orthopraxy versus orthodoxy, where, you know, where we all. What'd you say? Nah, what was that, Morgan?
I just said, oh yes, I love the orthodox orthopraxy discussion.
Okay. I thought you sneered for a second, but I was like, wait a second, we're about to jump into this. Okay, anyway.
Not sneering.
No, but I like this idea is that it's like, first of all, most people can't speak. Most people have a bad time or a tough time articulating what they think. Second of all, we don't even know the truth really. Like, we have a model of the truth that's like plausible at best and only allows us to like accomplish the one goal we designed for it to accomplish. Other than that, we don't really know anything.
Well, we know there's so much more we don't know. Yeah,
yeah.
Like what Peterson talks about with the unknown and the unknown within the unknown. I'm like, yeah, we have not covered it.
Yeah.
It's like,
so
you know, we think that we have all the truth, and in a sense we do, but like also we have so much more. That
well, and here's the point he makes too, is that it's like he says in one of his videos, you know, watch yourself for a week, and then you're gonna really start to figure out like what you truly believe and what you truly value, because you can say all these things, but your motor output is just one. So whatever you're doing, that's really what you're valuing above all the other motor outputs that you could potentially do.
Yes.
So yeah, orthopraxy sounds like the exact right thing to do. You know, let's all figure out how we can all enact the body of Christ together in a unified way. You know, and then whatever you say, like that, I mean, it's important, but it's not as important as far as I can tell. And I think what happens is on.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah. Oh no. Okay. So I'll finish that point real fast. Sorry.
Yeah.
The problem I have with social media is it's all text, it's all on your phone, and people go after Calvin J. Burke all the time on Twitter, and I'm like, just leave the guy alone. Like, you guys have no idea how this guy interacts with others. You have a few instances where maybe he did some jacked up things to Kwaku or to his family or something, but it's like, okay, other than that, how does he treat his neighbor? How does he treat those he loves? And I think if we were to like, this is never going to be possible, but if we were ever in a position to examine the life of Calvin J. Burke for a week, we'd find out he's probably a decent person, and he acts similarly to how we act. And so we're not in a place to judge him.
We'd see ourselves in him, I think. We'd see a lot of ourselves in him, whether we liked it or not.
Yeah, it's exactly.
I I went from like being like, this guy's awful, to being like, I follow him on Twitter. I find myself agreeing. You know, it's just funny how things shift like that. And when you're talking about orthopraxy, I kind of feel like I'm there now because, you know, I'm looking at the community of Christ and finding a lot of like the spirit in there. I don't know how to describe it. I really feel I'm feeling drawn to it. And I can see why so many LDS people, when they do leave, if they still want to stay in a church that's kind of similar,
Right.
but also different. They go to Community of Christ is because it's kind of moving away from orthodoxy and more towards this idea of orthopraxy. Like they're very active, you know, and like socially and in the community and all these things in a way that I feel like we focus a lot on, you know, right thinking, I feel like in the church, and like believing different things and, you know, having these beliefs and following the prophet and all this stuff. And I'm not saying that people don't like also practice their faith in the LDS church, of course they do, but I just feel like I'm seeing more of this kind of like practice, like, you know, go to the poor, like help people out. Whereas I feel like in the church, I'm just like I'm so much more concerned on my own stuff and on my family and all these things. And I just feel like I'm learning a lot, I feel like, about orthopraxy from the Community of Christ. And I'm taking that orthodoxy that came from, you know, the church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I still am attached to pretty much a lot of that. Like I still, you know, I can be singing like, you know, Community of Christ hymn. The next thing I'm singing, you know, Oh My Father, because I love this idea of a Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother, these parents that are watching out for us and they sent us here to earth. And like, I don't feel like I have to abandon that, you know, and I'm struggling to feel like, okay, what does this mean for temples? You know, like in my covenants, you know, if I were to like leave the church and I wasn't Community of Christ, like, how do I make all this kind of stuff work? Because it's this kind of like tension between the two, you know? And so I feel like
Joseph Smith himself, like when being interviewed for, you know, by an evangelical or someone, you know, he said, you don't even necessarily have to be Mormon to be saved or to be, you know, exalted into the celestial kingdom. So like, that's a big piece of information that we're all ignoring. You know, it's like,
don't tell the Death Notes.
I know, right? I mean, don't at me, but at me.
I'll be watching on Twitter.
Like,
but yeah,
like they're so like, I mean, against the backdrop of all these things that we don't know. DNC, go read the best books. You know, go find words of wisdom. You know, who was it? Was it Neil A. Maxwell who said it? I remember he's quoting someone. He said, no, it was Elder Eyring's dad who said, you know, my favorite part about this church is you don't have to believe anything that's not true. And it's like, yeah, go find a way. Like if something doesn't make sense to you, you know, go do some research. Like it's an open, like we live in the information age, or better said, the confirmation age, where people just fall into confirmation bias. But because that's a trap too. But
yeah,
go compare and contrast. And I don't know. I mean, it's hard because. Sorry, yeah, I cut you off. Go ahead, Anthony.
No, you're good. I was saying just go back to what Morgan was saying. You know, like how does individuation work within the church? You know, where we have kind of like a hierarchy, and we're expected to like believe certain things and kind of follow, you know, the leadership and all this stuff. But like, what does individuation really look like? You know, in the church setting? Because like we're individuals, but we're also formed by everything around us. And so, yeah, I think that work of individuation for the church, yeah, it's I'm going to be thinking about like, what does that look like? How does that work? You know, and we've kind of already talked, I guess, about that, what that would look like. But imagine if the church was all, you know, as a, you know, whole, like we were all trying to individuate, what would the church look like then? I don't know. Be interesting. I'd love to see it.
It's hard. It's like Zion is a place of one heart, like one mind. Oh, who knows? I mean, it's a tough thing to do, to be a one heart and one mind, because we're individuals too, and we have our different idiosyncrasies. But I think, I don't know, it's a big issue that we have. I think this is playing out in the political conversation right now, especially during COVID. It's like individuality versus a group mentality, and the extremes of both are really bad.
So if I could, I'd like to kind of wrap up my thoughts that I've shared with you today, with a little bit of a confession. So at the beginning was asked the question, why did I kick Jacob Hanson out of Lobsters? And then we talked about like shadow work and building this internal Zion and everything, because I'll admit, like, I do not have a Zion relationship with Jacob Hanson. And here's the confession of why. It's shadow projection. I do not like Jacob Hanson because I was just like him 10 years ago, and I don't like to see myself. That's the answer. And so,
right there.
And you know, and that's where my task is to love the Morgan that looked a lot like Jacob Hanson, so that I can love the Jacob Hanson. Maybe that's
They're
my.
just gonna be like, wow, they really don't like you here. Love you, Jacob, but also I feel the same way. So sorry, not sorry, I guess.
We'll see if I cut this little segment out of the whole thing.
Just get the front
But-
and the back.
No, I think you're making a good point.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It is hard to.
No,
I mean, it feels cringy when you meet someone who used to be like you, or the worst part of you.
Exactly. And that's why we say to do shadow work, because all of these problems in the outer world and in our relationships and everything, according to Jung, and I agree with him because I'm also a romantic and a Gnostic, it points to the internal conflict. The external conflict is fueled by the internal conflict. And that's been a big part of myself. And these workshops that I lead people through is all about that. It really is true. You know, the work of building Zion must involve the inner work of building an internal Zion. I really do believe that. And that's what I'm going to be going more in depth on at LobsterCon. Looking forward to it.
Awesome.
Sweet. Well, thanks so much, Morgan, for joining us and for giving us an insight into what you're going to be presenting at Lobster Conference. You know, if you guys haven't done your shadow work, come do it at Lobster Conference. It's a safe place. I think it is seriously like a safe place. Like, we are so diverse in so many ways, not just in like superficial ways, but there's a lot of people with a lot of different opinions. We're going to be sharing all those. There's going to be Q&A also, so if someone disagrees with me or with Morgan, we're going to hear it at Lobster Conference. I know even the speakers amongst ourselves, like, I mean, I love Allison so much. She's awesome, but we disagree on certain things, which is fine. Like, we can still be friends. And we're, you know, we all break bread, or hopefully, I don't know what they're having for catering, but I'm sure the bread will be involved.
We'll have something, some open table fellowship, no matter what it is we're eating.
Yeah.
Table
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and we'll wrap up. We'll see you guys, everyone. We'll see everyone on the next episode.
Great. Thanks for having me, Anthony and Alejandro.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Anytime.